Tanshi Kiowa. Hello, how are you all? Welcome to Homelands, originally broadcast on CFCR Community Radio 90.5 FM in Saskatoon, Homelands of the Métis and Treaty 6 territory, CFCR.ca. This is your favorite auntie, Andrea Letting Kashun. Call me Auntie Andy if you like, and I'll be your host today. I'm part settler, part relative, and 100% allied to everyone. I'm just me, not a card-carrying member of any Indigenous nation, but I am loved, adopted by, and related to many, rejected by a few. Haters gonna hate, relators gonna relate. I have Indigenous family relations and may secretly love them a little bit more than all the rest, but only because they are the first peoples of this land who have welcomed all of the guests. I am of Irish and a little Scandinavian with a serving of mystery, and that's the way I was raised, strongly decolonial with a strong sense of justice and a big related heart for all. I mostly relate to my Batosh Métis friends and family and culture, and have continued to try and live that beautiful good life, that Mio Pimitisawin. So from the fringes of the sash, I situate myself as relative and ally, and welcome you, my listeners, as brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, cousins, relatives in the homelands, and welcome our relative today, Armand Garnet Ruffo, who is joining us from out east today. So welcome. I'll just start with a land acknowledgement from Armand's community for the non-Indigenous listeners. We acknowledge that Armand's community is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. We thank these nations for their continuing care and stewardship over this shared land, and we are grateful to be able to live and learn on these lands. To acknowledge this traditional territory is to recognize a history that predates the establishment of the earliest European colonies, and to recognize this territory's significance for Indigenous peoples whose spiritualities and lifeways are tied to it and continue to develop in relationship to its other inhabitants, which today includes other Indigenous peoples and settlers from all over the world. With these good thoughts in mind, we work towards truth and reconciliation, in which each individual situates themselves meaningfully into this ongoing process. And now we'll get to a little bit about our guest today, who we welcome. Armand Garnet Ruffo is an Anishinaabe writer from Treaty 9 territory in Northern Ontario and an off-reserve member of the Chapleau Fox Lake Cree First Nation with familial roots to the Sagamok Ojibwe First Nation. Recognized as a major contributor to both contemporary Indigenous literature and Indigenous literary scholarship in Canada, he is the recipient of an honorary life membership award from the League of Canadian Poets, the Latin Writers Trust Poetry Prize for his body of work, and a Principal's Indigenous Teaching and Learning Award from Queen's University. His film work includes writing and directing a feature film, A Wendigo Tale, awarded Best Film at the 35th Annual American Indian Film Festival in San Francisco, USA, and Best Picture at the Dream Speakers Film Festival in Edmonton. His edited collections include an introduction to Indigenous literary criticism in Canada, 2016, and an anthology of Indigenous literature in 2020. Creative texts include Norval Morso, Man Changing into Thunderbird 2014, and Treaty Number 2019, both finalists for Governor General Literary Awards. His latest book, which we'll also talk about, is The Dialogues, the Song of Francis Pegamagabo, sorry, a literary adaptation of his musical libretto, which won the 2024 VMI Betsy Worland Between Genres Award. He currently lives in Kingston and teaches Indigenous literature and creative writing at Queen's University. Welcome, Armand.
My pleasure to be here. It's really nice to be here, Andrea. I don't want to say bonjour, Anin to everybody out there. And yeah, so I probably will read something and talk. This is pretty informal, as you said. So being the teacher, educator I am for many years, so over 30 years, I'll probably try to explain a few things but I guess there's no format, but what I'd like to say is just start a little bit to say that I am from Northern Ontario, and it was a time I grew up I was a kid in the late 60s and into the 70s, so I'm an old dude here, and but at the time I was starting to write, there was no real formal. Um, sense of Indigenous contemporary literature in Canada. It just didn't exist. If you went to university like I did, I had a grandmother, an Ojibwe grandmother, who was living in Toronto with my aunt. And at that time, early 70s, mid 70s, I guess it was, late, yeah, around, I forget now, a long time ago, late 70s, mid to late 70s. I went to Toronto and I went to university and I kind of crashed and burned. It was kind of a culture shock for sure for me. But I stuck it out for a couple of years and I took some literature courses and there was nothing. I mean, I was sitting in class and I think there were only about, I remember us, um, indigenous, we never used the word indigenous back then, but indigenous people meeting up, and there was about like five of us in the whole university at the time. So it was a different world. And so I'd take I started off in biology. Moved into writing because it's something I fell in love with. It was kind of a long boat route, but there was just no indigenous literature. So you take a course, and I was lucky. I had some good professors who let me study books that were written about indigenous peoples, like Rudy Weeb's The Temptation, the Big Bear. These are all books that came out in the 70s. George Riga, The Ecstasy of Rita Joe. Um, what else did I read? All, books from that time that I got to write about. And then by accident, I took a creative writing course. I know many young students now are interested in creative writing. Here at Queens, we have a creative writing program. And I just started writing my own work, but I didn't know what to do. Like most young people start writing and they just don't know what to do. They they write you know, copying. You just copy other what you think you know, people want to hear. So that's what I was doing, and I didn't really have a sense of my own self. I was young and about particularly how to write it. Then I went to visit my grandmother in Toronto. I said she was living with my aunt, and she asked me one day what I was doing, and I told her, oh, I'm taking some writing English courses, and she says, "Oh, I write poetry." And she read me a poem, and which I subsequently published because a couple of years later I was working for a magazine in Ottawa called a Native Perspective magazine. I published her poem, and she was thrilled. It was called "Lost Am I in My Native Land." And it was very Victorian. It was like Pauline Johnson, that kind of style. But it was the content that blew me away. She was talking about something that was really real to her. She felt lost. And and I think I took that to heart and I realized, well, my material was really how I grew up, where I was from. And then I made a switch. I started writing about my experiences. And then here I am today, all these years later, still doing it. And so yeah, for younger people, really find your material and how you live and where you grew up and all that kind of stuff. So one of the things that I realized as well is that, so we had to start creating our own literature. And then I met other Indigenous writers at the time, like the late Daniel David Moses, who became a playwright. Met Thompson Highway, eventually Marilyn Dumont, some of the people from out west you may have heard about, Louise Half. We all were around the same age and we all started meeting. And, we started drawing on each other's work and reading it and being inspired by it. And so, that's how it developed, and it moved fast so 1980s, Thompson was getting his plays produced and Native Earth in Toronto was taking off. And I know there was writers out in the West as well, Marvin Francis, those people, Gary Gottfredson out in BC, Jeanette Armstrong, of course, in the Okanagan, Lee Miracle, who was from BC and then moved to Toronto. So it was starting to happen really quickly, and I was just part of that, right in the wave. And so we're losing some of our writers today, which is sad, but they all made a huge contribution to where we are today, where we have, younger writers winning awards and they have work to read on there. And, when they go to university, they're not, you know, isolated. They can pick up our work and the anthologies. You mentioned the anthologies. that I had, edited. And I did that because I really wanted the work to get out there. So I co-edited an anthology of Indigenous literature for Oxford. I did an anthology of literary criticism by Indigenous writers writing about the literature. So it was all, to try to, get the literature on the radar, get it out there, get it into the universities. And, it's really flipped around now. So again, in the 70s, you would have been hard pressed. So to find a course in Indigenous literature, and when I eventually wanted to do that, to do graduate work, I had to go to the University of Windsor because they had one course. And it wasn't even called Indigenous literature, it was under semiotics, language studies, because, they were afraid, they didn't want to touch it. So there's one prof who was doing it, and I went down there to study with him. But now it's flipped. So you'd be hard pressed to go to a university or even college and find a course in English or writing without Indigenous literature. So it's like it's the opposite today. And so much movement, the 80s again, and then by 1990 it just exploded. So many writers were writing and starting to get published, and publishers were now more amenable to publishing Indigenous writers, and we moved from there. It was and here we are. And by 2000, there's all kinds of writers getting published, and now all these years later, 40 years later, whatever it is, yeah, it's everywhere. There's not I don't think there's an award in Canada that isn't where some writer hasn't, Indigenous writer hasn't won. So it's pretty amazing, and it's wonderful the opportunities. And it's really changed Canadian, right, literature in a sense, because it's really, it was hard to get published because we weren't celebrating, the colonial life. Like, but 1970 was a huge time of Canadian nationalism, and we were kind of writing against that, and so, we didn't fit. These magazines and journals were all, celebrating Canada, and we were kind of in the, on the outside looking in. I know George Manuel had written a book called The Fourth World, came out in the early 70s, and he talked about people living on the margins of an industrialized society, and that was, Indigenous people. And so we were tackling it from, a different perspective. But of course, as I remember Grand Chief Ovid McCurdy many years ago said, you keep a boiling lid on on a stove, eventually the lid goes flying off. And that's what kind of a nice kind of metaphor for what happened. So they couldn't ignore us, strength in numbers. It's the old, traditional story about the sweetgrass. One little strand is weak, but you braid them all together. And so we became, a force all together. And so we changed, we really changed, all of us together, the landscape of Canadian literature in Canada. So when I started then, um, I was drawn on my own, once I realized my own history. And so something I call hidden histories. And so I'll start then with a poem from my very first book. And this book was published by Thetis Books, which is a publisher where the late Greg Young-Ing was the editor of at the time. And Jeanette Armstrong was there with the Algonquin Center. And eventually I went there to teach uh, for a couple of years. I was teaching Indigenous Lit and creative writing. And so this book was published and by them. And so I wrote a poem that keeps getting anthologized, and I thought I would read it. It's called Poem for Duncan Campbell Scott. And, everybody knows the infamous Duncan Campbell Scott, who was really the architect of the residential school system, in the 1920s. Prior to that, he's the guy who made those schools mandatory, so kids had to go. And he was a poet himself. And ironically, his poems really drew on, his life in the treaty, because he was also a treaty negotiator So going up north, meeting indigenous peoples. And it was a very from he was a very colonial kind of modeled on, the British colonial, archetype. And so he really had a disparaging view of indigenous people. And but he ironically he met my great great grandfather in the treaty process. So he was a chief up there in northern Ontario. His name was Sakwashik. His English name was Louis Espanol. And so this poem, then, what I wanted to do, and so this came out quite early, and one of the things I had, 1994, and the poem was published, a few years prior to that. I wanted to flip the gaze around because in those colonial histories, you're always reading from the colonial perspective. So I switched the gaze around, and I start with a quote that I found about his poetry and his life, and as a poet, and I thought um, this is, for me, it was very ironic because I knew that he was kind of, you know, and how do I say this? He was just an awful person, and his poems were kind of stereotypical, Onondaga Madonna and all these poems about the dying. He called indigenous people a weird and waning race. So you couldn't get any more, kind of um, draconian and colonial than him. So anyway, it starts with a quote which I put in here because it's for me it's very ironic. A Canadian poet who had a long and distinguished career in the Department of Indian Affairs, retiring in 1932. And I found that in the Penguin Book of Canadian Verse, which had been published, I believe, in the 50s. So obviously they, thought highly of him, because they were also colonial. So here's the poem. Who is this black coat and tie? Christian severity etched in the lines he draws from his mouth. Clearly a noble man who believes in work and mission. See how he rises from the red velvet chair, rises out of the boat with the two Union Jacks fluttering like birds of prey, and makes his way towards our tents. This man looks like he could walk on water, and for our benefit probably would if he could. He says he comes from Ottawa way, Odawa country, comes to talk treaty and annuity and destiny, to make the inevitable less painful, bearing gifts that must be had. Notice how he speaks aloud and forthright, this or nothing. Beware, without title to the land, under the crown, you have no legal right to be here. Speaks as though what has long been decided wasn't, as though he wasn't merely carrying out his duty to God and King, but sincerely felt. Some whisper this man lives in a house of many rooms, has a cook and a maid and even a gardener to cut his grass and water his flowers. Some don't care. They don't like the look of him. They say he asks many questions, but doesn't wait to listen. Asks much about yesterday, little about today, and acts as if he knows tomorrow. Others don't like the way he's always busy writing stuff in the notebook he carries. He calls it poetry and says it will make us who are doomed live forever. So the poem then is, it's trying to be very ironic. In other words, it's trying to say something else about him. And when I comment that he's noble, he believes so highly in his work and mission, he looks like he could walk on water, like Christ. So the two Union Jacks, of course, are the British flags, and they're not fluttering, in the wind without purpose. They're like I'm putting them like birds coming into the attack. And he's coming to the tents where the people are, and he he already knows his purpose. He's trying to get the land. And that's what the treaties are all about. And the treaties, of course, as we know, were very unfair and unjust because most of the people had no idea what they were really about. And I can't even understand the legal language today. So imagine back then. So they were very unfair. They were saying we'll share the land when really, when people signed it, they were signing away everything. And as we know, the Huron Treaty was just kind of renegotiated and settled. And for the longest time, people were getting $4 a year, and that went for hundreds of years. So people were ended up starving because at the same time, and I say in other poems, railroads coming in, it's bringing in all kinds of trappers and miners and loggers. So the land's getting cut, people are getting pushed out. And so all this is kind of what's in this about to happen in this poem. And so, people, and he's very proud of his life. He's got a home. And notice I say his grass and his flowers. We don't own those. That's something so foreign to own the land like that. Everything's becomes fenced off. But people saying they don't care because he wants to know about yesterday because he's interested in the past. And because Duncan Campbell Scott was writing these poems about, the past. He doesn't really listen about what's going on today because he already knows that, and he doesn't want to know about the future, because for him everybody's going to die out anyway. So those were kind of what I'm getting at in this poem. And then, he's always busy writing stuff. Well, that's the poems that he goes on to write, and his idea that you know his poetry will last. And today, I don't think anybody reads it. So maybe we have our revenge some way in some way. We've written him out. So yeah, so that was the first book, and there's other poems about. I'll read one more about again what I call hidden histories, eh? And I think we're all, I think for Indigenous people it's different. For non-Indigenous people, they just feel they can write about anything. And I think, once you start moving into writing as an Indigenous person, you realize there's this weight of responsibility on your shoulders as well, because one of the things you realize you're speaking for people, who may not necessarily have had the chance to speak. And I think that's what this poem is about. Again, it's back to my great-grandfather Sequashik, and it says, although I never knew him, I am told when my great-great-grandfather signed away miles of home and bush, campfires hugged Lake Biscuitacing like moons, in treaty with the government of Canada, official men in official black suits. It is a special day, he pronounced, looking stern and proud, in this photograph shot in front of the Hudson's Bay Company store, while faces in the background, looking bewildered, looked on. And he knew also the momentous day meant change. Change, yes, like the seasons, he knew that. And standing like the trunk of a tree, dressed in leather and balancing his rifle, I am told, he said slowly in grave concern, looking beyond the heads of all, to me, now, squarely, some will learn and speak. So it's really about passing on the baton, so to speak. The photograph, the photographs there, which I have that photograph, and it was actually taken by Duncan Campbell Scott, and yeah, so I say like trunk of a tree because he's rooted in the land, and he's dressed in his best, he's dressed in he's prepared for the treaty, but he knows that it's momentous and it's going to bring about huge change. But at the same time, all the people were starving, so it's not like the chiefs had any choice. They were put up against a wall basically. So, see, take this or starve, because as I just said, so much change was happening at the time. So much so it's hard to really even fathom today, people were coming in by the hundreds. By 18 mid, mid early, yeah, after the War of 1812, by 1820s. And so there's thousands of people coming in every week from England and Ireland and Scotland and all the other, European nations that are French, French people are just coming in, pouring in because, there's famine in Europe at the time and all this stuff is going on. So people need a place to live. So where are they going to live? They're living all along, so-called Upper Canada, which is now Ontario, Lower Canada, Quebec, and it starts in the east and they just keep pushing west. And so, as you know, by 1885, 1869, 1885, they're already in the west. So it just keeps moving. But then people there get displaced. So it's happening. So that's kind of what I was trying to get at in these couple of poems there, and there's others as well in that book. And that's called Opening in the Sky. So, yeah, how are we doing for time so far?
Yeah, this is perfect. We're just coming up to kind of our last minute. So thank you so much for sharing those poems. It was really lovely. Like I've read them before, but to hear you read them in your own voice is a real treat. So yeah, so that concludes the first half of our hour of Homelands this Saturday morning with our guest Armand Garnet Ruffo. And we will be right back on CFCR 90.5 FM with the second half. So don't turn that dial.